What if the most profound acts of humanity emerge not from peace, but from the brutal crucible of war?
In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed through Normandy, a small contingent of German nurses found themselves encircled near their Red Cross uniforms, once symbols of neutrality, were now stained with the grim reality of a collapsing front. Under relentless Nazi indoctrination, capture meant disgrace, brutal interrogation, or worse. Yet, what unfolded next would defy every expectation, challenging the very definition of enemy. Imagine this. Exhausted American soldiers, their rifles slung, approached these German nurses not with shouts of command or a march to a barbed wire enclosure, but with a silent, yet crystal clear invitation. They gestured towards a makeshift field hospital. This wasn't just an act of pragmatism. It was an unprecedented psychological experiment in the midst of total war stark. Reversal of roles where enemy hands were sought not for shackles, but for scalpels. This wasn't merely a strategic decision. It was a raw, human challenge. Before we delve into the extraordinary untold stories of these women and the ethical dilemmas they faced, please take a moment to like this video and share your initial thoughts on this incredible paradox in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring more hidden histories to light. The summer of 1944 was thick with the rhythmic crunch of boots, the roar of military trucks, and the palpable disarray of a retreating army. Amidst this maelstrom, a small contingent of German nurses found themselves encircled near Cherbourg, Normandy. Their once pristine white Red Cross uniforms were now caked with dust and stained with blood, their hands still carrying the faint, lingering scent of disinfectant and gunpowder. Their relentless indoctrination had drilled into them the expectation that capture equated to dishonor, brutal treatment, or the most degrading forms of imprisonment. Yet, the unfolding moment brought an utterly unanticipated and profound turn. American soldiers, visibly weary, their helmets askew and rifles slung casually, approached not with shouts of command or the harsh shove towards a barbed wire enclosure. Instead, they gestured towards a field hospital. The nurses initially froze, convinced this was a cruel psychological ruse. However, the American soldiers simply stepped aside, guiding them not into a holding pen, but into rooms where stretchers lined the walls. Bathed in the dim glow of afternoon light, the invitation, though unspoken, resonated with crystal clarity. Help us. Nurse Elisavetse, identified only by this name in American records, later confided in her diary. My knees buckled when the officer pointed to the medical tent. I thought it was to be my punishment, but he simply said, "Go in. You can help." I could not comprehend it. Her words perfectly encapsulate the sheer disbelief of that instant. A sudden, jarring reversal of fate that guided her hands not into shackles, but to the pulse of the wounded. A profoundly surreal atmosphere permeated that makeshift hospital. On one cot, an American infantryman moaned through a morphine-induced haze. On another, a German prisoner, wounded by shrapnel, whimpered, his face pallid with terror. A potent confluence of antiseptic, tobacco smoke, and the measured cadence of footsteps on wooden floors filled the air. The German nurses hesitated, exchanging glances, as if in a silent, collective inquiry. Is this truly happening? Captain William Harris, an American doctor from Ohio, observed their palpable uncertainty. With a demeanor marked by weary yet deliberate patience, he handed a roll of bandages to one of the nurses and motioned for her to attend to a soldier's injured arm. There was no lecture, no threat, just a simple gesture that effortlessly transcended the language barrier. The scene, cinematic in its silent impact, was profound. Women who were enemies at dawn were now expected to transform into healers by dusk. The psychological burden of this transformation cannot be overstated. These women, raised within a system that lauded absolute obedience and ideological division, systematically dehumanizing the enemy, now faced a stark paradox within hours of their capture being treated as professionals, as human beings, and even as allies against the relentless advance of death. The initial chapter of this narrative is replete with striking contradictions. Outside, the clamor of war raged. Inside, the hospital offered an unnerving quiet. Rifles rested against walls while nurses and doctors exchanged glances over gauze and scalpels. For these German women, The shocking invitation to assist marked the genesis of a journey that would irrevocably alter their beliefs, test their profound resilience, and indelibly etch itself into their memories. Those inaugural hours within the American hospital felt akin to traversing a tightrope, suspended between two divergent worlds. The German nurses were no longer merely captives. They had, by an unforeseen twist, become reluctant colleagues, thrust into an uneasy collaboration with the very men who had defeated them. They carried no weapons, wielded no authority. Yet, with every bandage they applied and every pulse they monitored, they became, however, fleetingly connected to their erstwhile adversaries. Some of these women were later transferred to the prisoner-of-war camp infirmary in Dinsburg, Massachusetts. Here, the atmosphere remained saturated with profound contradictions. The walls, redolent with fresh paint and antiseptic, were adorned with American flags on the windowsills, stark reminders of whose soil they now occupied. On the ward floors, typewriters clicked out the names of the wounded, their rhythmic sound punctuated by the steady drip of morphine and the strained efforts of conversations struggling to bridge language barriers. Anna Vogel, one of the German nurses, later recounted in a letter smuggled out via Red Cross channels, "I stood with an American doctor beside a man from Bavaria whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. The doctor, in broken German, asked for my help in changing the dressing. I obeyed, even though every instinct screamed that he was my enemy. Yet in his eyes, I saw not triumph, but urgency. In that moment, I felt as if the war itself had yielded, allowing us to work." This peculiar professional camaraderie profoundly disquieted these women. They were accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of the military, where commands were issued sternly by German officers and errors met with scorn. In stark contrast, the American doctors, many of them conscripted civilian physicians, spoke matter-of-factly, often framing their requests as pleased rather than imperatives. One young lieutenant from Chicago even offered a nurse a cigarette after a particularly long shift, leaving her momentarily speechless. Each such gesture underscored the surreal nature of this transformation. Battlefield adversaries were now colleagues beside gauze and antiseptic. Profound psychological dissonance gnawed at these women during the long nights. Back in their wooden barracks, they whispered anxieties about whether this collaboration amounted to a betrayal of their homeland. Some secretly crossed themselves before sleep, wrestling between profound guilt and an unexpected sense of relief. Others simply grew silent, staring at the ceiling, as if listening for the questions they dared not voice aloud. The sheer numbers compounded their bewilderment. By late 1944, over 370,000 German prisoners of war were housed across more than 500 camps in the United States, stretching from Texas to Wisconsin. Among them were hundreds of medical personnel, nurses, orderlies, and doctors whose skills the Americans deemed too valuable to waste. This was both a pragmatic necessity and a profound ideological experiment. Could labor once dedicated to warfare now be redirected towards healing? A particularly symbolic moment occurred one evening when an American orderly accidentally dropped an instrument tray, sending scalpels clattering to the floor. Without hesitation, two German nurses instinctively bent down to assist him. Their eyes met his, moment of initial awkwardness dissolving into genuine human connection, where hierarchy, nationality, and enmity momentarily vanished. The day would often conclude in the quiet of the barracks, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Were they still prisoners, or had they entered into a state neither side fully comprehended? The days spent in the infirmary quickly revealed more than just medical duties. For the German nurses, the most profound shock was not merely the presence of American doctors, but the palpable sense of egalitarianism they displayed towards their patients, a concept almost anathema to those raised within the rigid hierarchies of the Third Reich. Captain William Harris, the Ohio doctor who first handed Elizabeth Kay a bandage, became a silent embodiment of this stark difference. Records indicate Harris frequently moved swiftly between beds, checking the vital signs of both American and German soldiers, addressing both with the same calm demeanor. The body wears no uniform. He was often heard to say a profound observation that both unsettled and captivated the women within earshot. For Hilde Blerau, a nurse who had served in a Wehrmacht field hospital near Caen, this contrast was particularly poignant. In her confiscated diary, later stored in the National Archives, she wrote, "I watched him clean a German soldier's wound with the same care he would give his own. No insults, no cruelty. My heart beat strangely. I thought of the doctors I knew in Germany who called our enemies vermin. I asked myself. Which approach truly embodied strength? This sense of respect extended beyond patient treatment. Nurses who had expected to be reprimanded were instead acknowledged for their professional skills. Lieutenant Robert Klein, an American surgeon, once consulted a German nurse about a specific dressing technique she employed in the field. The request rendered her almost speechless. She later whispered to a barrack mate, "I had forgotten what it felt like to be asked instead of commanded." The numbers underscore the scope of their experience. By late 1945, U.S. Army hospitals reported treating over 120,000 wounded and sick German POWs, achieving survival rates exceeding 90%, a figure almost unimaginable in war-ravaged European hospitals. For these captive nurses, these statistics were not abstract. They stood at countless bedsides, watched fevers recede, and saw both American and German men walk again because of this unexpected collaboration. Whispers and hushed comments soon permeated the barracks. Some women openly admitted their admiration for American medical practices, particularly the emphasis on hygiene and patient comfort. Others, clinging to stubborn pride, dismissed it all as mere propaganda. Yet, a seed had been planted, a growing awareness that compassion possessed a power equal to conquest. One evening, as rain pattered against the camp's tin roofs, an American doctor paused at the ward entrance, observing the women completing their tasks. The flickering lights illuminated white bandages, pale faces, and tired hands. In that tableau, the lines between enemy and ally blurred into an unexpected vision. The nurses did not speak loudly, but each carried the image back to the barracks, where the silence descended more heavily than words. This particular segment concludes not with a clamor, but with a question that lingered profoundly in their minds. If the enemy could heal without prejudice, what did that signify for the world they had once so fervently believed in? Beneath the pervasive scent of antiseptic in the infirmary, the lives of the German nurses unfolded in quieter, more clandestine ways. The hospital was more than just a place of initial shock and discovery. It was also a stage for hidden narratives, captured in hurried diary entries and whispered confessions after lights out, and a confiscated notebook discovered decades later within an Alabama camp archive. A poignant entry read, "I had expected chains, but I received respect. For the first time, I felt like a woman again, not a machine in uniform." The author, believed to be Nurse Gertrude Meyer, had served with the Luftwaffe Medical Corps prior to her capture. Her words reveal an ache that transcended national loyalties, a poignant longing to be seen as human, not merely a cog in Hitler's formidable war machine. Among the women themselves, there were moments of surprising candor. In one barracks, a nurse confessed to her bunkmate that she could not stop replaying the way Captain Harris had spoken to her calmly, measuredly, as if her opinion truly mattered. "I had forgotten the sound of respect," she murmured. Another, more cynical woman warned her not to be deluded. Nevertheless, the seeds of doubt were sown out about the enemy, and about the system they had once served without question. Such exchanges seamlessly integrated into the daily rhythm of camp gossip. Rumors circulated about a nurse who received extra cigarettes for her diligent work, or another who received a whispered thanks from a patient who had fought under Rommel in North Africa. These were not grand war stories, but minute human interactions that subtly unsettled their worldview. Even mundane details carried weight. The hot coffee offered during a night shift, the clumsy orderly who dropped his gloves and laughed at himself, the way American staff sometimes hummed softly while they worked. The numbers continued to frame their daily existence. Across the more than 500 POW camps in the U.S., approximately 10,000 German medical personnel were dispersed, many assigned to support American hospital wards. These figures served as a powerful reminder that their stories were not isolated, but part of a vast, covert experiment where labor facilitated reconciliation. Not all nurses welcomed this collaboration. During one heated argument one evening, voices rose in the barracks as two women clashed. One insisted that helping the Americans was an act of survival. The other contended it was an act of betrayal. Their dispute ended in silence, but the tension lingered, a fissure running through their shared captivity. Yet, amidst these unspoken conflicts, something fragile was taking root. The women began to measure their days, not just by the sound of guards' boots, but by the rhythm of human moments, grateful nod, a careful listen, a simple acknowledgement of their worth. At night, the hospital lights would dim, the ward descending into darkness. But in their minds, the glimmer of unexpected kindness persisted, lingering more profoundly than any command shouted in a German barrack. The infirmary transcended its function as a mere medical facility. It became a vital cultural nexus. Within its walls, German nurses encountered not only American medical practices, but also fragments of an entirely different world, one that often conflicted sharply with everything they had been taught to believe. This exchange was often clumsy, occasionally humorous, yet consistently illuminating. Communication unfolded in fractured segments. An American doctor would point to a syringe, slowly enunciating injection. A German nurse would respond with spritz, and both would nod, half smiling at the absurdity of piecing together language through gestures and repetition. Sometimes they would laugh at their own mistakes. At other times, silence filled the gaps, replaced by eye contact and shared intent. In one ward, a nurse named Liesel attempted to explain a traditional salve she used in the Bavarian countryside. Lieutenant Klein listened with genuine curiosity, meticulously scribbling notes on a scrap of paper. He later admitted to a colleague that he had never before considered that the enemy might possess useful knowledge beyond the battlefield. Conversely, the Germans marveled at the streamlined efficiency of American methods: sterilized packages sealed in wax paper, neatly arrayed bottles of morphine, and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of gauze. The numbers spoke volumes. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 2.4 billion dressings in German hospitals, by contrast, frequently grappled with severe shortages of basic supplies. For nurses who had been accustomed to the grim necessity of boiling rags for reuse, this abundance was nothing short of staggering. One nurse chronicled in her diary, "It was as if the war did not exist here. The shelves were full, as if the world was whole." Cultural disparities ran even deeper. Some nurses had never before spoken to a black person. Yet, within the American hospital, they observed African American orderlies working alongside white staff with a profound sense of normalcy that fundamentally shook their entrenched prejudices. The Reich had propagated a strict racial hierarchy, but here, in the ward, a black orderly named James Brown unhesitatingly handed instruments to a white surgeon, and the work of the room proceeded without interruption. For these German women, this scene planted quiet but indelible questions within their minds. There were also moments of unexpected levity. One evening, after a particularly long shift, an American nurse offered the German nurses a taste of peanut butter on white bread. The women hesitated, then chuckled at the strange, sticky texture. They whispered about it back in the barracks, dubbing it American paste, an inside joke that softened the iron-hard edges of their captivity. Day by day, these small, fragile, and sometimes comical cultural exchanges became an intrinsic part of their survival. Every shared glance, every fumbled translation, every unexpected lesson in medicine or food chipped away at the formidable wall the war had built between them. And so, under the hospital's dim lights, where scalpels glinted and shadows stretched across the floor, these women discovered that healing was not merely about mending wounds. It also opened doors to new perspectives. Now, I pose this question to you. If you were in their position, confronted with the unexpected kindness of an enemy, would you embrace it, or would you harbor suspicion? We invite you to reflect on this dilemma. The whispers within the barracks grew heavy. By day, the nurses assisted in the infirmary, their hands steady, their expressions composed. But by night, the wooden walls absorbed confessions, arguments, and gossip, revealing just how fragile their loyalties had become. The war had not truly left them. It merely reverberated within the private chambers of their minds. Rumors spread rapidly, fueled by boredom and the claustrophobia of captivity. One nurse claimed an American doctor had secretly given her extra aspirin for her headache. Another insisted she overheard guards discussing sending several women to work in civilian hospitals. Regardless of their veracity, these stories circulated between bunks like contraband, wielding more sway over perceptions than official directives. Diaries captured these silent storms. In one confiscated notebook, a young nurse wrote, "Every time I bandage a German soldier's wound with American gauze, I feel torn. I don't know, am I betraying my country, or fulfilling my oath as a healer. Another woman's entry confessed, "The Americans treat us like human beings, but my heart pounds with guilt. What if the fatherland were to learn of these sentiments?" These words, never intended for public consumption, spoke more profoundly about the true psychological warfare being waged within the camp than any statistic could. Not all the gossip was weighty. Some Venning's laughter broke the tension as a nurse mimicked the strange nasal drawl of a Texan guard, or exaggerated the American way of chewing gum. These small performances became moments of shared release, where even suspicion momentarily yielded to humor. Yet, beneath the laughter lay a persistent tension. Were they mocking their captors, or beginning to accept them? The Americans, too, observed this subtle shift. Reports from 1945 described improved cooperation among German medical personnel in POW camps, noting a marked decrease in disciplinary incidents as collaboration increased. One American officer documented that hospital ward productivity improved by nearly 20% following the integration of the nurses into daily tasks. The numbers attested to what the whispers had revealed: something fundamental was changing. But the most dramatic moments often arose in arguments. In one documented incident at a Wisconsin camp, two nurses nearly came to blows, one insisting that aiding the Americans was an act of survival, the other denouncing it as treason. The conflict was only quelled when a senior nurse matron intervened, declaring with a trembling voice, "We are here to heal, not to kill." Her words echoed long after the argument ceased, permeating the thin walls of the barracks. Subtle, personal connections also blossomed, despite remaining taboo. A nurse who received a grateful smile from an American orderly might replay it in her mind for days, uncertain if it was kindness or something more. These gestures, seemingly insignificant to the outside world, carried immense weight within the fragile bubble of captivity. Thus, within the confines of the barbed wire, humanity wrestled with ideology. Whispers transformed into questions. Questions evolved into doubts. And doubts began to reshape identity. Now, decades later, looking back at this story, we are left with a fundamental question. Would you resist the kindness of the enemy, or would you allow it to transform you? This historical narrative is etched not only in archives, but in the reflections it provokes. By 1946, the gates of the prisoner of war camps creaked open, releasing thousands back into a world scarred by war, yet trembling with the promise of peace. For the German nurses, their departure was neither a victory nor a defeat. It was a profound and complex metamorphosis. They carried bundles of clothes, a few diaries secreted within their uniforms, and memories that would forever haunt their sleep. Their final days in the camp were charged with palpable anticipation. At dawn, trucks rumbled, and the barbed wire fences, which once felt like impregnable cages, now seemed more like fading demarcation lines on a map. The American guards, who had once observed their every move, now stood with casually crossed arms, offering neutral farewell. Some even raised a hand in a gesture of quiet respect. The symbolism was unmistakable. They were still prisoners, yet they were treated with a dignity that undermined the very simplicity of the word prisoner. For many, the most enduring image was not of the gates, but of the infirmary. They recalled the scent of iodine, the flickering lights, the peculiar taste of peanut butter, and the hum of broken English phrases. They remembered Captain Harris leaning over German soldiers, tending to them with the same meticulous care they afforded American boys. They recalled the awkward, yet profoundly human, laughter when a doctor attempted to pronounce Guten Morgen. Most importantly, they remembered the exact moment they were first asked to help, a moment where fear fractured, transforming into profound possibility. Statistics outline the magnitude of their journey. Among the 371,683 German posts detained in the United States were thousands of women, predominantly nurses and auxiliary personnel. Over 120,000 prisoners received hospital care in American facilities, boasting survival rates exceeding 90%, a figure almost unimaginable in war-ravaged European hospitals. Behind these numbers lay countless dressings applied, fevers reduced, and words whispered in the wrong language, yet still understood. For some, the change was profound. Letters smuggled home in 1946. Revealed near confessional reflections. I entered as a servant of war, but I left, knowing that compassion is stronger than command. Others admitted to persistent confusion, torn between loyalty to a devastated homeland and gratitude towards those who had offered unexpected respect. As the buses pulled away from the camps, the women took one last gaze at the American landscape. Fields stretched endlessly, dotted with barns and telephone poles, symboled of an abundance they had never known. In the reflection of the glass, their faces bore the marks of disbelief and exhaustion, but also a faint hint of something akin to profound understanding. The symbolic final image is of a nurse clutching a worn stethoscope to her chest, the camp receding behind her, the barbed wire glinting in the sunlight. To her, it was no longer a mere cage, but a strange sanctuary, a place where the enemy became a teacher, and where humanity proved itself more powerful than hatred. And so, they returned to a broken Germany, forever indelibly marked by an experience that would quietly ripple through their lives, indelibly shaping their memories of war and the elusive promise of peace. The story of these captive German nurses did not conclude at the barbed wire or the camp gates. It lingers in the small, fragile details, the hastily written diaries hidden in shoes, the taste of peanut butter recalled with a chuckle decades later, and the silent image of an American doctor unhesitatingly cleaning an enemy's wound. These moments, seemingly insignificant against the immense destruction of World War II, held a transformative power no statistic could fully capture. History often records wars through numbers. 60 million dead, thousands of cities destroyed, millions Yet, amidst these figures are the lives shaped by encounters that defied the logical calculus of hatred. For these nurses, the unexpected invitation to assist American doctors was not just a task, it was a revelation. They entered the camps as servants of an ideology that dehumanized others, but they left bearing an undeniable truth, that compassion could traverse ideological boundaries more effectively than conquest. Years later, some of these women would recount to their families stories of American hospitals, of abundant supplies, and of the respect they felt for the first time while in uniform. Others would remain silent, hoarding their memories like contraband perhaps, out of guilt, perhaps out of fear of not being believed. But in both silence and spoken words, the memory endured. Long after the war, one nurse confessed to a friend that she still dreamed of the distant hum of rivet guns from American factories, the very sound of a nation whose vision of life, prioritizing dignity over weaponry, had eclipsed that of her homeland. It was this memory, not of rifles or tanks, that haunted her. Perhaps this is the lesson bequeathed to us. War will always be remembered for its battles, but the true measure of humanity lies in the quiet choices made in hospitals, in barracks, and in the profound whispers that bridge the divide between enemy and self. Thus, decades later, we are left with a question, not just for historians, but for ourselves. In times of conflict, do we choose to preserve our hatred or uphold our humanity?